What if the new breakthrough drug isn't discovered in a lab, but designed by artificial intelligence? From predicting molecules to simulating drug trials inside a computer or maybe a smartphone in future, AI is quietly reinventing how we discover medicine. And what made you take the leap from big tech into drug discovery?
So, what we have done at Pauling is we have created an AI agent. You can think of it as a ChatGPT, kind of tool that does many of those same tasks in early stage drug discovery.
So, how do you convince a scientist that has been in the lab for more than 20 years and how do you convince that person that AI is suddenly here either to replace him or enhance his science?
One of these, science historians that said that science advances one funeral at a time. Because sometimes the old generation will never change their mind, right? But eventually, folks that have been trained in an old way of doing things will die, and then a new generation comes in that has been trained in a new way of doing things, and then that generation, makes the decisions, right? I think at some point over the next few years, we're probably going to see drugs approved that were designed entirely using AI.
What's one thing human scientists will always do better than AI? What if the new breakthrough drug isn't discovered in a lab, but designed by artificial intelligence? From predicting molecules to simulating drug trials inside a computer or maybe a smartphone in future, AI is quietly reinventing how we discover medicine. But how close are we actually to that future? And what should pharma leaders be doing right now to prepare? That's exactly what we'll unpack today. And also, spoiler alert, today's guest might be one of the very few people who's gone from writing code at Google to helping AI write the future of medicine. Welcome back to the best AI show on pharma. I am Ayush Mishra, founder at Enervia, where we help pharma organizations use AI to make smarter and faster commercial and clinical decisions. This show is about simplifying the complex, cutting through the buzzwords to talk about what's actually working in the real world. My guest today is Javier Tordable, founder and CEO of Pauling.ai, a company combining artificial intelligence and molecular simulation to accelerate drug discovery. So before launching Pauling, Javier spent more than 16 years at Google, leading AI and cloud projects across life sciences and healthcare. And now he's bringing that engineering mindset into biotech. Javier, welcome, and it's awesome to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ayush. It's my pleasure to be here.
And I've got to say, most people spend years to get into Google, and you are one of the very few who said, "All right, cool, I've conquered that. Now let's go solve drug discovery."
Yeah, I mean, it's Google is a fantastic company, right? I only have positive things to say. My time over there was a great learning experience. I also had a chance to work on really interesting stuff. In multiple places within the company. I spent some time in search and ads and cloud, like all the largest teams within Google. And I really enjoyed it. But at one point, I decided that I wanted to focus 100% on drug discovery. And the best path for me to do that was outside of Google. So, I mean, I still have a lot of friends, many people that I talk to regularly. And who knows, what the future may bring, right? Like maybe at some point, I'll go back or Google will buy my company, right? Who knows, right? But for now, I'm very happy that I get to work with a few other folks that are excited about drug discovery in Pauling, and I get to run the company and do interesting work. Hopefully, will have an impact on the lives of people.
All right, so let's start right at the foundation. Tell us what you're building at Pauling.ai and what made you take the leap from big tech into drug discovery.
So let me tell you a little bit about um, drug discovery from first principles. Right, there are a couple of ways that people typically find new medicines. One of them is maybe serendipitously because, there's some substance in nature that seems to have some effect. And then scientists, take it, purify it, test it in different ways, and then they apply it as a medicine, right? So many times, antibiotics, for example, were found like that, right? Penicillin. I think there's a story about Alexander Fleming. How discovered it in the lab, realized that it killed bacteria, and so on. Most drugs, I mean, maybe not most, but a big chunk of them were found that way. The other way that drugs have been discovered, especially recently, is using what's called rational drug design, in which we use what we know about molecular biology, about how different molecules interact inside of a cell and what causes the disease, and then we find other molecules that may work very well for or interact in a specific way with some of these other molecules that are inside of a cell. So to give you another example, maybe we understand a little bit about cancer biology, and then we know that cancer cells um, um, avoid the immune system. They do that using certain surface proteins in the cell. So we can go and say, okay, or the scientists, could say, if we could um, prevent those proteins in the surface of the cell from binding to something else, then the immune system would find that cancer cell and then would kill it. And that's kind of the origin story of the what's called today checkpoint inhibitors, or like PD. Um, PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors. So then somebody can go and say, well, let's find a monoclonal antibody, for example, that binds to that specific PD-1 protein, and then the immune system would go and kill that cell. So there is a systematic process that you would follow from identifying a specific target to designing or finding a molecule that binds to that target. And that is, the initial phase of, what's called drug discovery. Now, there are, of course, many other things that are required, right? So once somebody has a molecule that could be used as medicine, there's all sorts of things that need to happen, experiments on cells and animals or organoids or all sorts of different things. And once there is enough, I would say, uh, certainty about the safety of that molecule, one could begin, clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Like there's, years of clinical trials that need to happen. But that very first stage is basically going from an idea about a potential therapy to a molecule that can be tested. Now, that process typically is very time intensive. And there are, it's done sometimes at universities, sometimes at companies, right? But it is one of the big, I would say, roadblocks to developing new medicines. It takes years, and it costs a substantial amount of money, and it requires a certain level of expertise. It is not something that a regular biologist or an MD or somebody with a knowledge of a disease could do. It requires a very, very deep understanding of molecular biology and different ways of designing molecules or finding them and so on. So what we have done at Pauling is we have created an AI agent. You can think of it as a ChatGPT, kind of tool that does many of those same tasks in early stage drug discovery. So you come to the tool and tell it, I'm interested in this specific bacteria, for example, and then we would identify a protein that is a potential target to kill that bacteria, and then find a small molecule, an antibiotic would typically be a small molecule, find a small molecule that binds to that target. And we do that in a fully automated way. So somebody that wants to go through that process could be a biologist, for example. They don't have to understand computational chemistry. They don't have to understand how to set up all these tools, how to run experiments, how to analyze those experiments, how to orchestrate everything together, how to, download and massage all the data, all the things that somebody would typically have to do, which is part of the reason why the process takes, many months or years. So what we have done is essentially automate that entire process and put it behind an interface that looks a little bit like ChatGPT, little text window and so on. But our tool different from ChatGPT, can run a lot of computational chemistry tools, right? So a lot of, we don't need to get into the details, but like what people, typically use for this type of tasks, docking, molecular dynamics, admit, prediction models, and so on and so forth.
So, so basically, what you're saying is, so in your case, you're actually not using AI to sort of replace scientists. You're just giving them that computing power and the pattern recognition that earlier would sort of take sort of years to do, and then they can do it faster now.
Yeah, it's basically giving a tool for scientists to do early stage drug discovery, but much, much faster and in a much more comprehensive way than they could before. So, if you think about it, the same way that you could go to if you're a writer, right, and you need to do research for an article, you can go to ChatGPT or you can go to Claude or any of these models and say, "Hey, I'm doing some research for this specific article. I want you to crawl all these links, gather all this information, structure it in a way, and then you can do the last analysis, for example, and then write it in your own voice, right?" So it's the same way that, before scientists would have a team of computational chemists and biologists and people that had experience doing these things, or they would hire a company to do it for them. And, they would set up the project, with the constraints that they need. And then the company would come back and say, here's my list of top hits. So what we have done is basically replacing that, right? But ultimately, of course, that has to be a scientist that understands a little bit about, well, what is the disease that we want to tackle, how we're going to do that, and kind of validate that the model is performing well. But not a team of a dozen people, right? As before, right? But hopefully, just a single person, can drive this entire process. I mean, part of it is of course being able to do things more effectively and save time and money, right? Like I think a lot of folks within pharma, that's what they care about, right? I think for me, the motivation is also that um, I believe there are many, many diseases that we are not tackling, that we're not working on today, precisely because the process is very expensive, right? So it may cost a minimum of, a few $1 million to go
Yeah.
from an idea to some molecules that can be tested properly. Now, um, if we can make that process drastically cheaper, right, then we may be able to tackle some of these diseases that are not as commercially interesting, right? There are lots of rare diseases, lots of I don't know, like strains of bacteria, right? That for which we have no possible medicine or whatnot, right? So if we could make that process better, we could tackle a lot of these diseases, right? So for me, it's not so much about making biopharma more efficient, even though of course that is a big benefit. It's more um, enabling access of this technology to more people, so we can actually cure more diseases.
No, and I love that, and that's, I mean, I resonate with that mission a lot myself as a founder, as being a founder of a startup that helps pharma, and it's actually something that we talk a lot about at Enervia, in terms of how AI talent and those engineering frameworks from big tech are now moving into life sciences, and kind of helping an industry which is known for its extremely slow adoption rate of new tech, and now this new wave of AI is kind of helping them move at a digital pace. So I congratulate you, Javier, on this mission. And I think what you're doing in the mission, this has far greater impact than probably what we can even imagine today. Uh,
We can hope, right? I mean, it's still early for us, so we haven't accomplished what we set out to do yet. But we're working very hard, so hopefully, in a few years, we can go and say, yeah, we did it.
of course. So although you answered this question, but if you sort of have to break it down, so I mean, for most people listening, R&D is still kind of a black box, and everyone just kind of wonders every time, why does it take for a new medicine to sort of come out in 10 to 15 years, and why do we spend billions of dollars? And of course, your mission does help mitigate those cost and timelines to a bit. But if we kind of break it down, where exactly does AI fit in the whole process?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the different stages that are involved here, right? So there's maybe a part of what's called in silico drug discovery, which is typically done with computer simulations that may take a year. Then there is um, maybe preclinical work or IND enabling work, which is typically done in cells, different types of biochemical assays, structural assays, um, animals, and so on and so forth. Um, and then um, part of the reason why that second phase takes a while is because sometimes the biology takes a while, right? So if imagine, for example, that you want to find a cancer medicine, right? And you need to take an animal with a cancer. Typically, that tumor is grafted inside of that animal. So you need to do that, and then wait a little bit, make sure that that animal is still is alive, right? Then you apply the medicine and then see what happens to that tumor. And then you need to wait a certain amount of time to see if the tumor comes back or not, right? So that entire process may take a few months, right? It takes a few months instead of years because typically these experiments are done on mice, right? That may live 2-3 years, right? So people would typically check that the mice recovers, for example, and then after a few months, the cancer doesn't come back. Now, quite often that experiment doesn't succeed at the first try, right? Part of the problem is that people don't maybe they don't do all the simulations that they could do at the beginning, right? So they find out a little bit later that the molecule is not as good. So what happens is somebody has to come back and then make some changes and then try a novel molecule. So every time that you do one of these iterations, it takes several months, right? So if you need to, go back 2 or 3 times, right? 3 times times 3 months, plus a little bit of padding, that is basically 1 year, right? That you spend, doing experiments on animals, even after you have already a molecule.
3 months and then 3 mice as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, you would probably use a few dozen, for each experiment, plus controls, plus maybe positive controls and other things. So, like, fortunately, these things require a lot of animals as well. Um,
Yeah.
but also people do things in different phases, right? So you may do what's called a structure. Let's say when you say, well, I imagine that my molecule has some effect on a specific protein, but you actually have to test, right? Like you don't really know for sure what happens in real life. So you have to go and um, take that protein, purify it, add your kind of binder, your small molecule, then get it to kind of crystallize together, then get a structure for it. This process also takes many weeks or months of work. Um, and then if you want to check toxicity, for example, right, like, there's different, assays that you can use, right? So you may do one and then another, right? So this process basically has a lot of different phases and it just takes a very substantial amount of time. Now, after completing this, if the data looks good, meaning the molecule seems safe enough in a variety of animals, then plus a few other things that are required, right? Like one a company could apply for an IND, to the FDA, for example. Similar in other countries, and then that is essentially permission to start giving this molecule to humans, right? So then comes the clinical trials, which of course are very expensive, right? Just like anything that requires, human doctors and human patients and hospitals and all sorts of people to administer the trials. Now, many times trials take a long time because of the recruitment of the patients. So that is a massive problem, right? So
Yeah.
you can think of, if you have a molecule for a rare disease and you want to start testing it, in patients of that disease, then you actually have to go and find those patients, right? Like it's not like there's a registry of everybody in the world that suffers from a disease, right? So if it's a really, really rare disease, sometimes people would go in like a Facebook group, right? And then you like go and find people on that Facebook group. Um, Sometimes if it's a cancer, for example, right? Like maybe there's no Facebook group for that specific cancer, but you have to go and find hospitals where they do it and find the patients and so on. So many times, clinical trials take literally years because recruiting patients, takes a long time. Now, of course, in humans, in order to do an experiment properly, many times we just have to wait until we see the results. So, for example, in the case of cancer, a clinical trial, which is basically an experiment, may involve taking different patients, giving them the the molecule that we want to test to some group and then giving something else or the standard of care to another group, and then completing that treatment that may take months, for example, and then waiting to see if the treatment effectively eliminates the cancer or if the
Yeah.
cancer comes back. And the FDA typically would ask to wait 5 years, right? Like that's basically the kind of endpoint, right? Like does the person get into remission, right, or does the cancer come back within less than 5 years? So that means the experiment is going to take at least 5 years. There's no way around it. So then when you keep adding a lot of these things, you end up having, multiple clinical trials for which you have to recruit people and they take years of work. And then eventually, all that data is compiled and then the FDA reviews it. They are not super fast either, right? So they may take, months, right? They're actually not working right now because of the shutdown. I don't know, like, what would be the date that somebody may be watching this, but there's a government shutdown happening in the U.S. right now, so the FDA is now reviewing applications for now, and who knows how long that is going to last, right? So a lot of these things, when you compound that, basically explain why it takes 10, 15, 20 years to find a new medicine. Now, I think the potential areas to apply artificial intelligence across this process are many, 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 and very varied, right? So, we talked a little bit, of course, in the preclinical, but in the in silico work, that's basically what we're doing in the uh, kind of in vitro or animal testing. There's all sorts of things that can be done. For example, automating many different ways to do experiments to make them faster, to make them more consistent. That is actually a big problem. Typically, experiments don't replicate very well, but if we could automate them, for example, using AI-driven robots, those experiments will probably be more consistent, and then the results would have higher quality. Clinical trial recruitment, for example, is an area that could be ripe for disruption. But like if there was a way to find people easier and faster, and to structure trials in a way that are more likely to succeed. For example, applying the right criteria to recruitment of that trial. Say, getting genomic information, for example, and then making sure that there is a good match between the drug and then the patient population. And then even things as mundane as processing the documentation from that trial.
Yeah.
Many times, companies will spend, weeks, months, processing all that documentation, reviewing it, make sure there are no mistakes. Um, this seems, it seems trivial for somebody that doesn't have experience in pharma, but there are literally people whose entire job is, to copy, data from one place to another, right, for a clinical trial. So I think, tasks like that could probably be automated if we have AIs of, enough quality, right? And that would, of course, make the process much faster, right?
Wow. That is so amazing and spot on, Javier. So I mean, you talked about how patient recruitment is one of the biggest bottlenecks. And we at Enervia, we are actually right now building an AI agent that actually helps solve that problem. So we in partnership with Komodo's data set of 330 million US patients, we are kind of trying to build an AI agent that helps trial organizers identify where the right patient is. So I completely agree and understand what you're saying. But then there is one challenge that I'm sure both of us sees across pharma is mindset, right? Uh, Scientists and probably I would assume your users, they're trained to trust evidence and sort of not algorithm, at least not AI. So how do you convince a scientist that has been in the lab for more than 20 years, and how do you convince that person that AI is suddenly here either to replace him or enhance his science?
Um, I don't know if there's a best answer to it. There was this saying, I think it may have been Karl Popper, or, one of these, science historians, that said that science advances one funeral at a time. Because sometimes the old generation will never change their mind, right? But eventually, folks that have been trained in an old way of doing things will die, and then a new generation comes in that has been trained in a new way of doing things, and then that generation, makes the decisions, right? Um, so I mean, I suspect something like that may end up happening here. It's kind of hard to say. I'll say that even in software engineering, right, which is of course an area in which I'm more familiar with after having a couple of decades of experience. Not all software engineers believed initially that language models could write code effectively, right? And even people that understood that it was possible, they thought that it would take many, many decades to get to a level of quality where it could replace a human person. But what we have seen, obviously, right? If you anybody that has used, Claude CLI or Codex or one of the many systems that are working today, Debian, there are many of them. We have seen that these systems can write code with a reasonable level of quality. They can do when prompted, in a correct way. They can do things that human engineers will take much longer to do. They can work for in many cases hours. And if they have the right tools and if they are set up the right way, they can accomplish tasks that would take many days for a human engineer. And we have seen that people that use the systems effectively are, easily an order of magnitude more productive. Now, of course, it's not, they're not magical, right? Like, we haven't reached a point yet where they can really replace a person, right? And, many times, the problem is, prompting them the right way, making sure that all the context is added, right? But I think it's been very clear over the past few years that for a lot of folks in technology, the mindset has shifted from a language model would never be able to replace an engineer to, I think that you probably replace at least junior engineers over the next few years. And then, of course, they're going to end up replacing more experienced people, right? The moment that they get a little bit better understanding requirements. So we have not reached that yet within drug discovery, right? Like, I think we're still a little bit far. And, you know, in other areas outside of software engineering, there is this problem that the people building the systems are not necessarily the people that have an intuitive understanding of the problems, right? I think one of the reasons why automation or AI for automation of software engineering has succeeded so much in the past few years is because the same software engineers that build these language models, that build these agents for software engineering, are the folks that have a good understanding of how software has to be built.
Correct.
Whereas in any other area, it's a little bit harder, right? So, you don't have marketers building, AI agents for marketing, right? Like, they typically rely on software engineers. You don't have, drug hunters, building, AI agents for drug discovery, right? Even though like we have, people that have experience, with drug discovery, but typically it requires a combination of skills. I think at some point over the next few years, we're probably going to see drugs approved that were designed entirely using AI. I think some of the ones that are most advanced in terms of clinical trials today are from in silico medicine. I think they have a fibrosis drug, for example, that just passed a phase 2. And I think there are a few others. But once those drugs start getting approved, hopefully in a few years, I think the kind of opinion of scientists in the field will start shifting to
Yeah.
realize that some of these tools are very, very useful, right? And at the right combination of human and tool can make a massive difference.
Yeah, you make an interesting point, and you took an example of your experience with the software industry. So you built systems at Google that served billions. So what lessons from the big tech do you think pharma needs most right now?
Um, so that's a very hard question. I mean, I mean, big tech does things I think a little bit differently than most other industries.
Yeah, I mean that's
Uh,
precisely what I'm trying to understand. So I mean everyone knows that big tech is aggressive. They're more they're more they're larger risk takers. Whereas when you run a clinical trial, fail fast, which is a fancy term in big tech, doesn't really work in pharma. So how does these two sort of combine together into a common ambition and mission? Yeah.
well, I mean, I'm not sure. Um, I'm not sure it wouldn't work in pharma, right? I think
Yeah.
that's arguable. But I'll tell you an example of a practice that not just Google, but other companies within big tech apply, which I think would be interesting in other industries. So one thing that a lot of the companies would do is they look at their products as a portfolio of different technologies, different tools, different products. And some of them may be more risky than others in the sense that they may or may not work, over time. And that is okay, right? Like, it's possible to look at things that may be very risky that make sense in the context of a portfolio. Now I think, um, everybody in pharma, like a large pharma company, for example, would have a variety of different molecules for different diseases, right? But you don't typically, I think, would think about it as, something that is a sure bet, and something that is, maybe very risky, and something that is so completely crazy that nobody would fund it, right? But that's effectively what happens within tech, right? So sometimes, somebody would come one day and say, you know what, we're building teleconference system that uses holograms to project a 3D image of a person, right? This is a real project, right? A VP somewhere just would say, you know what, like this, may be incredibly risky. It makes no sense whatsoever, but it just sounds very cool. Just go ahead and, spend, that $20 million, to go and build a prototype and build that technology, right? And there is an understanding that, in the, 1 in 100, probability that that thing will succeed, it may be massive, right? But many times it just won't, right? But you never know, right? And if you think about it, back maybe, 5, 6 years ago, right? Somebody at Google, right? Like, Google was growing a lot in cloud, lots of resources were being spent, growing the cloud business. Um, but Google had a research team, and somebody said, you know what, we're going to do research on how proteins fold, right? Like, Google, right, as a tech company that sells advertisements and runs, YouTube and runs the display network and runs a cloud business, somebody went and said, we're just going to do research on how proteins fold, right? And we're going to put people on it, and they put, 10, 15, 20 people, right? Eventually that team grew a little bit and found something that will end up winning the Nobel Prize.
I think there's the same team that's based out of London who also now released that model that predicts protein structures. Am I right?
Yeah, AlphaFold. Yeah, AlphaFold is the
Right.
model that predicts protein structures, right? But the point is, now of course it seems like, yeah, no, this was an incredible task, an incredible scientific achievement, literally at the highest level. Like it is
Yeah.
literally a Nobel Prize winning scientific achievement. But sometime, 5 years ago, someone decided, okay, we're going to spend X million dollars funding this project that has no possible way of making money anytime soon. And we're just going to put money there instead of going and building the next, ads, product, right? Or building whatever feature on a phone. So um, that is a very risky bet, right? And I think a lot of tech companies are willing and ready to do that. Whereas almost nobody within traditional industries thinks that way, right? So you would not go and think, FedEx, doesn't wake up one day and say, I think tomorrow we're going to start launching satellites into space, right? Or J&J, doesn't wake up and say, I think we need to start doing experiments in zero gravity. So we're going to ship our next drug to the International Space Station and then do our next
Yeah.
experiment there, right? Like, I think people are not willing to take the same level of risk that folks within big tech are willing to take.
I agree with you. Even the risk capital is higher on the big tech side, as compared to big pharma. Uh, so to all the pharma leaders that is listening to this video right now, uh, where do you propose they start? So I mean, I understand it's a big curve, it's a wide variety, and I mean, we at NREA we talk to pharma leaders on a daily basis, and I know personally there are many companies who sort of have built-in separate budgets for AI transformation. They just doesn't know where to start from.
Yeah.
So in your perspective, where does a pharma leader start if that person has to start on his AI transformation on the clean dev side?
Yeah, I mean, I think um, you know, part of it, of course, involves bringing the right people. right? Folks within, from within, big tech, or people that have experience working in this, with this type of mindset. Of course, that means paying people the right salaries for that, and big tech, pays very well, right? So it's very hard, I guess, for, if you're a medium-sized biotech and you think, well, my budget for the next, IT director is, 100,000 a year, and you go and say, well, but I want to hire a former VP of a big tech company, right? Well, spoiler alert, that's not going to work, right? You will not, be able to find a VP of a former big tech company that is willing to work for you for $100,000 a year, right? Like that is just not possible. So I think, making sure that there is enough budget to bring in the right people, um, and then empowering those people to actually make decisions, right? I think a lot of companies would, maybe bring somebody in as a transformation specialist, right, or as an AI expert, that helps other parts of the company. But then that person doesn't necessarily have the decision power, to actually decide, what programs get funded or not, to bring in other people, to build teams, to drive initiatives, right? So I think, bringing in the right people and empowering them to actually make decisions, is probably one of the most important things. And then I would say, another thing that would probably make a difference is, and this is one of the areas that, I've thought a lot about myself, because I have, quite a bit of experience building tools. Uh, but within tech in general, and within software engineering in particular, I think any good software engineer appreciates the importance of having good tools. There's a reason why software engineers have got, easily a million times more productive, over the past, 50 years. Easily, right? If you think of, in 1970s, right? Like what would it take to build a web server, that serves, content dynamically to somebody, that they can interact with a mouse, like, any rich website experience today, right? It would have taken, literally hundreds of people working for many years developing all sorts of technologies, right? Like it was just not possible, right? Um, and now, an average software engineer can do that in one afternoon. With the help of AI tools, not even one afternoon, right? Like this literally a few hours. Yeah. So the increase in productivity has been many orders of magnitude. Now, the reason that has been possible is because within software engineering, we, the community, have spent an enormous amount of resources building tools, and then building tools on top of each other, right? We created programming languages and compilers and, IDEs and operating systems and so on and so forth, so that an engineer today, when they build a tool, they don't have to build everything from scratch. They import a library and a web server and deployment system and so on and so forth, right? And a lot of those things are incredibly easy. Now, that appreciation for the usefulness of tools, I think, hasn't translated into other areas, right? And I think, within pharma in particular, of course, like people understand the importance of scientific tools of discovery, microscopes and so on. But yeah, I mean, I would be surprised, for example, if any pharma company was spending, hundreds of millions of dollars building better electron microscopes, right? For example, right? Like, I mean, I don't think anybody's doing that. Like maybe Thermo Fisher is doing it, right? Because they sell, that's their product. Um, but if if you told me that, you know, Eli Lilly, for example, was spending $100 million building better microscopes, I'd be like, nah, I don't believe that. I haven't heard of that, right? But there's no reason why not. I would tell you right now, Google spends more than $100 million building better tools for software development. I'm 100% certain, right? Probably an order of magnitude more than that, right? Yeah. So there's no reason why, other companies could not do the same investment.
Wow. So I mean, so that's the big lesson right there that the pharma can learn from big tech is how to look at internally into your own productivity. So you spoke about building. I mean, how software companies have built tools for their internal productivity. Gen AI today seems like that one tool that can sort of build productivity for the pharma in next decades. You yourself is working on the same technology, I would assume. Uh, So, how do you see Gen AI evolving as a tool of productivity for scientists and users? And then, how do you see them making the transition from Gen AI to the AI agents that you are making to an AGI in the future and maybe an ASI? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody knows. I would say, um, so some of these tools are very powerful, right?
Yes.
Language models are very, very powerful, but they are still, they can't do everything by themselves, right? So if you go and tell ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or any other language model that you prefer, I want you to build me a tool that makes this specific process in my pharma company better. Doesn't know how to do that. Doesn't understand your process. Doesn't understand what
Yeah.
data is. It doesn't understand, how you make decisions. There are lots of things that still need to happen. I think over the next few years, we're probably going to see a little bit of a shift where folks, like myself and others, are going to build tools that adapt the language models to specific workflows, to specific tasks within pharma, right? I mean, in our case, of course, we're doing computational chemistry and we're automating that computational chemistry. But you can imagine, easily people creating tools that apply language models to clinical trial design or to experiment design or to all sorts of different wet lab kind of processes. Um, or deciding where to invest, right, or what technologies are more or less useful, or which scientists to fund with grants, right, a lot of the different things that are happening inside of a pharmaceutical company. And I think um, it will be interesting to see whether that innovation comes from biopharma itself, or it comes from people outside of the field that decide to switch and join it. I mean, it's kind of hard to say. I think a lot of pharma companies have started to sign deals, with AI startups, kind of,
Yeah.
uh, you know, in a way, outsourcing that innovation. I think some of them are definitely starting internal teams as well to kind of try to do some of these things. But of course, with all the challenges that come from being able to find the right people and empower them and so on that we talked about before. Um, so I don't know exactly how it will turn out. Right, I think it's probably going to be a combination of different things.
Right. Do, do, do you have a perspective or a vision of how an AGI or maybe an ASI look for pharma drug discovery in the future?
Um, I think it's still very unclear how. Um, an AGI or an ASI, even if it was possible within the next few years, it's very unclear how it actually um, it would solve certain problems, right?
Right.
If you think about it, um, there are problems that are more easily solvable, right? Because we know how a human could solve them, right? So maybe your data is not properly well structured or properly documented, right? But an AI, you know. Whatever form it takes, an AGI, could probably look at it and do some research and then try to figure it out. Now, there are problems for which, even if you had uh, superhuman level intelligence, it would not be able to answer certain questions, right? Because the answer, it is not obvious, even with the entirety of human knowledge, right? So if you go and try to predict, is this molecule going to be a potential cure for something, without doing the right experiment, without doing the right simulations, that is just impossible, right? No amount of intelligence would would be able to do that without actually running those experiments, right? Unfortunately, in the world that we live in, the chemistry and the physics and the biology is too complicated, right?
Yeah.
So um, that AI would have to do the experiments, right? And I think the value would be in designing and running those experiments quicker than humans can, um, iterating faster and learning faster than humans can. But there is a little bit of a limit, right, on how
Yeah.
fast things can be done, right? So even if you had an ASI that comes and says, well, I'm going to design a lab that is fully automated, and I'm going to run the lab to do more experiments, and then I'm going to use those experiments to come up with the cure for every single cancer, known to man, right? That maybe a decade or a few decades from now, something like that would be realistic. But there's still a sequence of steps that need to happen, right? So again, it's not magic, and there are constraints within any of these
Yeah.
systems.
I hear what you're saying, and I understand there's a sequence of steps, and during this all sequence of steps, there are at every step there are different challenges, that either propel you towards it or just do the opposite. And hence, every step has its own risk. What are those biggest challenges or roadblocks, or the biggest barriers that you see in AI, in pharma today, either in terms of adoption, regulation, anything?
Funding would probably be one of them, right? Like, spending enough money to adopt these systems. Um, Trusting. I wouldn't say necessarily trusting, setting up guardrails to understand how the boundaries of how the system works and make sure that it's working properly, right? And then once those guardrails are in place, then trusting the system to actually do what it needs to do. I think there's at different stages there are different levels of acceptable failure, right? If you are trying to do research on a molecule that then you test on animals, right? Like maybe you can accept that you're going to have experiments that will cost money and will not be useful, right? And now, of course, if you're doing an experiment in humans, um, your threshold for risk has to be much lower, right? But I think in many cases, even in tasks that are not really that critical, I think the threshold for risk is lower than it could be. Um, I think another constraint would be uh, setting up infrastructure in a way that is conducive to deploying some of these AIs properly. Yeah, like the kinds of stuff that honestly people have been talking about for a decade, right? Like pretty much for as long as I was part of Cloud, right? Having uniform data storage, making that data accessible to other people, making it searchable, and so on and so forth. I think even today, a lot of companies are just not ready to do that, right? So like if you could, you know get one of these models, right? Like some of these models are open source, right? ChatGPT, of course, is not, but like, DeepSeek, for example, is open source. Somebody can download it and run it. You could say, well, if you are an Eli Lilly or a J&J, you can 100% download the weights of that model, fine tune it on your data, and then have that model answer questions about all your data internally in the company. I don't think there's any large pharma company in the world that would be even ready to do something like that. But like it just requires having a level of maturity in your infrastructure, in your data management, right? That which just does not exist. A lot of that stuff is not, it's not super complicated research work,
Yeah.
right? It's just somebody has to go and budget for it and hire the people and do the cleanup and so on and so forth, right? It's all traditional engineering work.
So, in terms of your mission at Pauling, then where do you see the world 5 or 10 years from now? Do you see organizations that are R&D organizations that run entirely on AI? I know there are many companies like Vision or Medicine, if I'm not wrong, Biobenevolent, if I'm pronouncing it right. Companies.
Yeah, benevolent. Yeah, benevolent, for
Benevolent.
example. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and companies like yours as well. How do you see this? This new wave of startups like yours. Sort of paint the world in next 5 to 10 years in terms of R&D.
Um, I think we may reach a world where most of the in silico drug discovery world is drug discovery tasks are automated, where there are very few humans that actually do this. So if you, I mean, it's kind of hard to compare, right? But if you think of because we haven't reached the same level of automation anywhere else, right? But if you look at code generation, for example, right, which is maybe the most mature, uh, this uh, the systems that generate code today do not generate 100% of the code. But in some companies, they may do, 20, 30, 40, 50%. I think it may be realistic to get to a point where the systems generate 90% of the code and then somebody reviews and supervises and kind of, adjust a little bit here and there. I think it may be the same thing for drug discovery, where we have systems that read every single paper, every single scientific paper that is published, systems that keep an eye on what kind of molecules are easier to synthesize in real life, and then what kind of technologies are useful, and then continuously look for indications and molecules that may be applied to those. And then they design experiments, and then they have a budget for running experiments in whatever way they think is most convenient. And then that system may be continuously churning novel molecules for certain underserved, indications, right? And that thing may be running 24/7 autonomously,
Yeah.
coming up with novel molecules, uh, day and night. I think it's entirely possible that something like that could be built, within the next 10 years. And then the constraint would be, well, we still need to do animal experiments, we still need to do clinical trials, right? These processes are still expensive. Hopefully, I don't know, it probably won't be us, but somebody else, is working to optimize clinical trials, is working to make those processes cheaper, right? Uh, so, if we have 1,000 different potential molecules for potential indications, somebody may come in and say, what, we're going to do this, 25, right? And then we're going to put, $1 billion, we would run those trials and then, come up with more data. But I would love to see a future in which we have more than 40 drugs approved every year, right?
Right.
30, 40, right? Like that's kind of the average in the US, right? So I don't see why with the same level of kind of spend that we have today, we couldn't take that 10 times higher.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. I think that's a very fascinating future, and obviously something that AI founders like me and yourself do envision, and do this is a dream that keeps us awake at night. Let me now move to our last segment, which is kind of a fun rapid fire, and let's see how a software engineer does in that as well.
Or
Uh, so I have three quick rapid fire questions, you know, uh, and this is the first one that I shoot. So if AI were your lab assistant, what's the first task you'd hand off?
Oh, fundraising. I hate it. It's just so time consuming. So if an AI could do it for me, I'd sign up for that today.
All right. What's one thing human scientists will always do better than AI?
Mm, I would say deciding what's important for humans. Like we
Awesome.
will probably have a better taste for what we care about than any AI.
Meaning they always need to be in control.
Not necessarily in control, but a human would decide that solving this disease is more important than solving another disease, right?
Oh, that's insightful. And third, which is actually my most favorite question of the day, if you are having dinner with Linus Pauling, I'm assuming he's going to be in your guest list, hypothetical guest list, because he's already let you his name. So if you're having dinner with Linus Pauling, what would you talk to him about AI?
Oh, that's a great question. Um,
Or maybe how good Linus Pauling would have used AI to even do better than what, I mean, he anyways did great. I mean, but even do better.
I mean, yeah, he was, in some ways he was ahead of his time, right? I would say, yeah, I mean, I would love to get his take on where some of these tools might be more useful for scientific discovery, right? Whether it would be, reading papers or automating other tasks or running simulations or doing the calculations that scientists don't want to do, right? I mean, I'd love to get his take on, like, if he had this um, superhuman assistant, right? Like, where he would put that superhuman assistant to work. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be fascinating.
Where
You
where
know,
where would you imagine him putting that assistant?
hard to say. I mean, one of the things that I think he was very interested in was, like, this the connection, right, between structure and function, right? And I would say, if we could get the structure of every single protein, right? And how those proteins interact with each other, right? Like why don't we just do that across every single known protein in nature, right? And see what happens. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to imagine, what such a celebrated scientist would think. But I imagine he may want to like explore some of these things in detail, right? I don't know. I think it's a very hard question. I don't know how I would answer.
I thought it's fair to ask. I mean, since you named the I'm assuming you named him
Yeah,
after.
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Yep, yep, yep. It was yeah, I mean, I think it was when I was looking for names for the company, right? I was inspired by Tesla, for example, right? And I thought, now people know more the car company than the scientists, right? And then I was looking for other famous scientists, whose name was available as a domain name, right? I think that's a constraint, for a lot of company names these days. And then Pauling.ai happened to be available, and I thought, okay, I mean, this is fantastic, I guess we are now in a Nobel Prize season, right? So Linus Pauling, I think, is the only scientist that won two Nobel Prizes without sharing with anybody, right? So like he was the only person that was declared the winner in those. Like there have been other people that won two Nobel Prizes, I think another three people, but they were all shared. And Pauling, I think, was the only one that has won two unshared Nobel Prizes. So that's a small club. I wish more people were familiar with his work, right?
Yeah, and out of those two, one is a Nobel Peace Prize. So one was for science and one was for peace. So
Correct.
perfect. So before we close this discussion of Javier, one final question or probably an advice. So what is that one big advice that you would give to those budding entrepreneurs? Or kids who are in their 20s sitting in Asia, in Africa, who are trying to build a company that helps life sciences advance using AI. What is that one big advice you'll give them because they don't have access maybe to that kind of funding or even data sets? I mean, I talk to founders across the biggest problem that they face is where do they find the data, because most of the data that is premium is proprietary. So where do you find data in an open source model that you can create something which is also of value? So what is that one advice you would give those budding founders?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the good thing about healthcare is that it's a global industry, right? Like, there's always going to be a local hospital or a local doctor, to collaborate, right? And to work on. I would encourage people to learn how to use the tools that are coming up and get up to date. These tools are incredibly powerful. And then just try things, right? One of the great things from one of the nice practices from big tech that I think more people should replicate is to try different things and then see what works, right? And not be afraid of spending time or resources on it, right? Like many times um failure is acceptable, right? And it's just a step along the way. So just try things and see what works.
Awesome. Oh yeah. This has been such an insightful conversation and honestly really fun conversation as well. You've made complex science feel human and exciting. Thank you for that. And to everyone listening, if this helped demystify AI, share it with a colleague who still thinks algorithms belong only in IT. This was the best AI show on Pharma. I am Ayush Mishra from Enervia. Thanks for turning in, and I'll see you next time.